training compound as Sophia Martinez adjusted her grip on the Barrett MRAD rifle. At 24, she stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, her slight frame dwarfed by the massive .338 Lapua Magnum weapon that seemed almost comically oversized in her delicate hands. The other recruits had gathered in clusters around the shooting range, their whispered conversations and barely concealed snickers forming a soundtrack of doubt that had followed her for the past 6 months. "Look at little Sophie trying to handle a real rifle," came the voice of Sergeant Rick Morrison, a hulking man whose biceps were larger than Sophia's entire torso. His cronies erupted in laughter, slapping each other on the backs as they watched her methodically check her equipment. "That Barrett weighs more than she does. She'll probably dislocate her shoulder on the first shot." Sophia had heard it all before. Every variation of the same tired jokes about her size, her gender, her supposed inability to handle military-grade weaponry. When she first arrived at the elite sniper training program, the instructors had looked at her application twice, convinced there had been some administrative error. A former librarian from a small town in Nebraska had no business attempting one of the most demanding military specializations in the world. The program director, Colonel James Harrison, had initially tried to discourage her enrollment. "Miss Martinez," he had said during their first meeting, his weathered face creased with what he probably thought was paternal concern, "sniper training isn't just about pulling a trigger. It requires tremendous physical strength, mental fortitude, and frankly, the ability to carry equipment that weighs more than you do. Have you considered other military occupational specialties? Perhaps intelligence analysis or communications?" But Sophia had not traveled halfway across the country and left behind her quiet life among books and reading programs to be shuffled into a desk job. Her father, a Marine veteran who had died when she was 16, had taught her to shoot before she could properly ride a bicycle. Weekend trips to the range had been their special time together, just the two of them and the peaceful silence that came after the sharp crack of gunfire. He had seen something in her steady hands and patient demeanor that others missed, a natural ability that transcended physical limitations. "Shooting isn't about muscle, Mija," he would tell her in his gentle voice, using the Spanish endearment that made her feel safe and loved. "It's about breathing, patience, and understanding the mathematics of distance and wind. Your mind is your greatest weapon, not your body." Those words echoed in her memory now as she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. The other trainees were impressive specimens of human physicality, former football players, wrestlers, men and women who looked like they had been carved from granite specifically for military service. Next to them, Sophia looked like a teenager who had wandered onto the wrong movie set. Marcus Chen, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, shook his head as he watched her adjust the rifle's bipod legs. "I feel bad for her," he said to his training partner, David Kumar. "She's going to wash out in the first week, and everyone's going to remember her as the girl who thought she could be a sniper. That's going to follow her for the rest of her military career." The training cadre seemed to share this sentiment. Drill Sergeant Patricia Williams, herself a decorated veteran and one of only 12 female snipers in active service, approached Sophia with a mixture of sympathy and professional obligation. "Martinez," she said, her voice carrying across the range, "you sure about this? There's no shame in recognizing when something isn't the right fit. We can get you transferred to a different program by this afternoon." Sophia looked up from her rifle, her dark brown eyes meeting the sergeant's gaze without flinching. There was something unsettling about the quiet confidence she projected, a stillness that seemed at odds with her youth and apparent inexperience. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor of nerves she felt in her chest. The response drew more chuckles from the assembled group. Tommy Rodriguez, a stocky former Army Ranger, mimicked her voice in a high-pitched falsetto. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Sergeant." His impression was met with another round of laughter, and even some of the instructors couldn't suppress their grins. As the weeks progressed, the mockery only intensified. During physical training sessions, Sophia struggled to keep pace with her larger, stronger peers. While they effortlessly completed obstacle courses and carried full rucksacks on 20-mile marches, she fought for every step, her smaller stature making every challenge exponentially more difficult. Her bunk was searched for performance-enhancing drugs by suspicious instructors who couldn't believe she was completing the requirements through determination alone. "She's got to be getting help somehow," Morrison confided to Chen during one particularly grueling week. "Nobody that size survives sniper training without some kind of assistance. Maybe she's got connections, family in high places or something. The academic portions of the training told a different story entirely. While her peers struggled with ballistics calculations and environmental factors, Sophia absorbed the information like a sponge. Her background as a librarian had given her research skills and attention to detail that served her well in the classroom portions of the program. She could calculate bullet drop and wind drift in her head, while others fumbled with calculators and reference charts. During one particularly complex lesson on long-range shooting fundamentals, instructor Captain Michael Torres presented the class with a scenario involving a 2,800-meter shot in variable wind conditions. The target was a simulated high-value individual, and the students had to account for temperature, humidity, altitude, and the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself affecting bullet trajectory at extreme distances. While the other students worked in groups, passing around calculators and consulting reference materials, Sophia sat alone, scribbling numbers on a notepad with a pencil worn down to a stub. Within 10 minutes, she raised her hand. "Martinez," Captain Torres called, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Given the environmental conditions you've described, the shot would require 127 clicks of elevation adjustment on a standard mil-dot reticle, with a 3.2 mil wind hold to account for the crosswind from the northwest," she said, without consulting any notes. "The bullet would have a flight time of approximately 4.1 seconds, during which the target could potentially move up to 12 feet at a standard walking pace." The classroom fell silent. Captain Torres double-checked his own calculations, running the numbers through the ballistics software on his laptop. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression of grudging respect. That's correct, Martinez. Very impressive." But even her academic excellence couldn't silence the doubters. "Book smarts don't mean anything when you're trying to make an actual shot," Rodriguez muttered to anyone who would listen. "You can calculate all you want, but if you can't handle the rifle, if you can't control the recoil, none of it matters." The psychological pressure was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Sophia's ordeal. Every night, she would lie in her narrow bunk and listen to the whispered conversations of her fellow trainees, dissecting her performance and predicting her inevitable failure. Some of the comments were merely dismissive, others carried an edge of cruelty that cut deeper than she cared to admit. "My little sister could probably outshoot her," she overheard Kumar saying one evening. "I don't know why they're even wasting time with this charade. She's going to get someone killed if she ever makes it to an actual deployment." The isolation was complete. During meals, conversations would stop when she approached, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. Group study sessions excluded her, forcing her to prepare for examinations alone. Even the instructors seemed to view her as an inevitable casualty of the program rather than a legitimate student. But Sophia persevered, drawing strength from memories of her father and the quiet confidence that had sustained her through years of being underestimated. She had always been the smallest person in any room, the quietest voice in any conversation. People consistently mistook her gentleness for weakness, her thoughtfulness for uncertainty. What they failed to recognize was that beneath her unassuming exterior lay a core of pure, unshakable determination. The mockery reached its crescendo during the 8th week of training, when the students were introduced to the Barrett MRAD, the multi-role adaptive design rifle that would become their primary tool for long-range precision shooting. The weapon system, with its modular design and exceptional accuracy, represented the pinnacle of sniper technology. It was also, at nearly 20 pounds fully loaded, a formidable physical challenge for anyone to handle effectively. When Sophia approached the rifle for the first time, the snickering from her classmates was audible from across the range. The Barrett seemed to dwarf her entirely, its massive suppressor extending well beyond her reach when she tried to support it properly. Morrison, never one to miss an opportunity for ridicule, called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey Martinez, you need a step ladder to see through that scope." The laughter that followed was the kind of cruel, pack-mentality humor that had defined her experience in the program. But as Sophia settled into position behind the rifle, adjusting the bipod and checking her sight picture, something shifted in her demeanor. The uncertainty and nervousness that had plagued her for weeks seemed to evaporate, replaced by a focus so intense it was almost palpable. She had arrived at the moment her father had prepared her for, the convergence of all those weekend shooting sessions and patient lessons about breath control and trigger discipline. This was where the mockery would end, where the doubters would finally understand that true skill couldn't be measured in inches or pounds. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the 1,000-meter range. In just a few hours, Sophia would attempt a shot that would change everything, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been dismissed because of their appearance or underestimated because of their background. The Barrett MRAD lay ready, its precision-machined components waiting to deliver a message that would echo far beyond the confines of the training facility. As she prepared for what would become the defining moment of her military career, Sophia couldn't help but smile at the irony. All those whispered conversations and cruel jokes had been building toward this single instant, this one opportunity to prove that excellence couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The same people who had spent months predicting her failure were about to witness something that would force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be a sniper. The morning of the long-range qualification test dawned gray and overcast, with a persistent drizzle that turned the training grounds into a muddy quagmire. Sophia had been awake since 400 hours, not because of any official requirement, but because sleep had become impossible. Her mind raced through calculations and scenarios, replaying every lesson her father had taught her during those precious weekend sessions that now felt like a lifetime ago. What none of her fellow trainees knew, what nobody in the entire program suspected, was that Sophia Martinez was not exactly who she appeared to be. The quiet librarian from Nebraska carried a secret that would have changed everything about how she was perceived, if only she had been allowed to share it. But military regulations and a promise made to a dying man had sealed her lips, forcing her to endure months of humiliation in silence. Her father, Sergeant First Class Miguel Martinez, had not simply been a Marine veteran as she had told her classmates. He had been one of the most decorated snipers in Marine Corps history, with confirmed kills spanning 3 separate combat deployments and a record that remained classified even 15 years after his death. The weekend shooting trips had not been casual father-daughter bonding time. They had been intensive training sessions designed to pass along knowledge that had been earned through blood and sacrifice in the mountains of Afghanistan and the urban battlefields of Iraq. The official story was that Miguel Martinez had died in a training accident at Camp Pendleton when Sophia was 16. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more painful. He had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer, likely caused by exposure to depleted uranium rounds during his service. The doctors had given him 6 months to live, but he had stretched those months into 2 years through sheer force of will and in desperate determination to prepare his daughter for a life he somehow knew she would choose. Mija, he had told her during one of their final sessions together, his once steady hands already beginning to show the tremor that would eventually claim his legendary marksmanship. There will come a day when people doubt you because you're small, because you're quiet, because you're a woman. They'll think they know what you're capable of based on what they can see. That's when you'll remember everything I've taught you. The promise she had made to him was simple but binding. She would never trade on his reputation to make her own path easier. Whatever she accomplished would be earned through her own merit, her own sacrifice, her own determination. It was a promise that had cost her dearly over the past 8 months, but it was also the source of strength that had carried her through every moment of doubt and humiliation. Now, as she prepared for the qualification test, Sophia could feel her father's presence like a physical weight on her shoulders. The Barrett MRAD seemed to hum with potential energy as she performed her pre-firing checks, each movement precise and economical in the way that only comes from thousands of hours of practice. The test itself was designed to eliminate the marginal performers and identify those with genuine aptitude for long-range precision shooting. Students would be required to engage targets at distances ranging from 800 to 2,000 meters, under varying weather conditions and time constraints. The pass rate historically hovered around 30%, and that was among candidates who had already survived 8 weeks of grueling preliminary training. Sophia's assigned firing position was at the far end of the range, isolated from the main group in what the instructors privately called the graveyard, the spot reserved for candidates expected to fail. The location was intended to minimize the distraction when she inevitably broke down or walked away in defeat. Instead, it provided her with something she had desperately needed throughout the entire program: solitude. As the other trainees settled into their positions with much fanfare and mutual encouragement, Sophia worked in methodical silence. She checked and rechecked her equipment, confirmed her range cards, and settled into the firing position that her father had drilled into her muscle memory years ago. The familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder felt like coming home. The first phase of testing began with targets at 800 meters, a distance that was challenging but manageable for most qualified marksmen. Sophia's first shot was met with a brief pause from the range safety officers, followed by hushed consultation over their spotting scopes. Her bullet had struck the target dead center, punching through the X-ring with surgical precision. Her second shot followed the first with mathematical certainty, creating a hole so close to the initial impact point that the spotters had to use magnified optics to confirm it was a separate hit. By her third shot, a small crowd had begun to gather behind her position, drawn by whispered reports of her unexpected accuracy. "No way that's possible," Morrison muttered to Chen, who was struggling with his own targets at the same distance. "She's got to be getting lucky, or the wind is helping her somehow." But as the distances increased and the conditions became more challenging, Sophia's performance only improved. At 1,200 meters, with a crosswind that was causing other shooters to miss their targets entirely, she continued to place rounds with mechanical precision. At 1,500 meters, shooting through a mirage that made target identification nearly impossible, her bullets found their mark with inconsistency that bordered on supernatural. It was at this point that something shifted in the atmosphere around the range. The casual mockery and dismissive comments gave way to a tense silence as both students and instructors began to recognize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Drill Sergeant Williams, who had spent months predicting Sophia's inevitable failure, found herself holding her breath as she watched the slight figure behind the massive rifle. "Where did this come from?" Captain Torres asked Colonel Harrison, who had arrived to observe the final phase of testing. "Her training records show adequate classroom performance, but nothing that would predict this level of practical skill." Colonel Harrison studied Sophia through his binoculars, noting the professional composure and efficient movements that spoke of extensive training. There was something familiar about her technique, a set of mannerisms and procedures that reminded him of someone he had known years ago. But the connection remained just out of reach, dancing at the edge of his memory like a half-remembered dream. The revelation began to unfold during the 2,000-meter phase, when environmental conditions deteriorated to the point where even experienced instructors were having difficulty spotting impacts. A sudden shift in wind direction caught several students off guard, sending their carefully calculated shots wide of the target area. But Sophia seemed to anticipate the change, adjusting her aim before the wind flags had even begun to indicate the shift. "How did she know?" Kumar asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment rather than his usual condescension. "The wind change hadn't even reached the shooting line yet." The answer came from Master Sergeant Jake Rodriguez, an old-timer who had been running sniper training for nearly 2 decades. He had been watching Sophia with growing recognition, pieces of a puzzle falling into place as he observed her unique shooting style and uncanny environmental awareness. "I know those techniques," he said quietly to Colonel Harrison. "I've only seen one person shoot like that before, and he's been dead for 15 years. The colonel's head snapped around, his attention suddenly focused entirely on Rodriguez. "What are you talking about, Master Sergeant?" "Miguel Martinez," Rodriguez replied, the name dropping into the conversation like a stone into still water. "Gunnery Sergeant Miguel Martinez, 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. He had the longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history until it was reclassified. That girl shoots exactly like he did, same pre-shot routine, same way of reading environmental conditions, same trigger control." Colonel Harrison felt the blood drain from his face as the connection finally crystallized in his mind. Martinez, he had known Miguel Martinez, had served with him during a joint operation in Afghanistan more than 20 years ago. The man had been a legend even then, capable of shots that defied explanation and possessed of an almost mystical ability to read wind and weather patterns. "Martinez," he said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "Sophia Martinez, that can't be a coincidence." As if summoned by their conversation, Sophia looked up from her rifle for the first time since the test had begun. Her dark eyes met Colonel Harrison's across the distance, and in that moment, he saw something that confirmed his suspicions, the same quiet confidence, the same unshakable focus that had made her father a legend among professional snipers. The final phase of testing was about to begin, and Sophia had not yet revealed the full extent of her capabilities. The 2,500-meter targets awaited, along with a special challenge that the instructors reserved for only the most exceptional candidates. A shot that would test the absolute limits of human skill and equipment capability. But more than targets and distances were at stake now. With her secret on the verge of being exposed, Sophia faced a choice that would define not just her military career, but her entire relationship with the promise she had made to her dying father. The weight of that decision pressed down on her as she prepared for the shots that would either vindicate her months of suffering or expose the deception that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her training. The Barrett MRAD felt different in her hands now, charged with the potential energy of revelation and the approaching moment when all pretense would fall away. Around her, the whispered conversations had taken on a different tone, no longer dismissive, but tinged with awe and the growing recognition that they had fundamentally misjudged the quiet woman who had endured their mockery with such grace. The transformation was already beginning, but the true test was yet to come. At 3,000 meters, under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced snipers, Sophia would either prove herself worthy of her father's legacy or see that legacy tarnished by her failure to live up to the standards he had set. The moment of truth was approaching with the inexorable certainty of a bullet in flight, and there would be no opportunity for second chances or explanations. The announcement came with the casual cruelty that had defined Sophia's entire experience in the program. Colonel Harrison's voice carried across the suddenly silent range as he outlined what he called a special demonstration, an unscheduled addition to the qualification test that would separate the truly exceptional from the merely competent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his weathered face betraying nothing of the internal storm that had been building since his recognition of Sophia's heritage. "We're going to conclude today's testing with something unprecedented in the history of this program. The meteorological conditions and range availability have aligned to give us an opportunity for a 3,000-meter precision shot." The collective intake of breath from the assembled students was audible even over the persistent wind that had been plaguing the range all morning. 3,000 meters, nearly 2 miles, represented the absolute outer limit of what was possible with current rifle technology and human skill combined. It was a distance that existed more in theory than practice, a mathematical exercise that few marksmen would ever attempt under combat conditions. Morrison, who had been struggling with targets at half that distance, let out a nervous laugh. "That's impossible," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Nobody can make a shot like that consistently, it's just showing off." But Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing Sophia's performance with growing amazement, knew better. He had been present 15 years ago when Miguel Martinez had made a shot at 2,847 meters in the mountains of Afghanistan, eliminating a high-value target under conditions that military meteorologists had declared unsuitable for long-range shooting. The feat had remained classified, known only to a handful of personnel, but it had established Miguel as perhaps the finest precision marksman in military history. "The target will be a standard NATO E-type silhouette at 3,000 meters, Colonel Harrison continued, his eyes finding Sophia's position at the far end of the line. "Environmental conditions include a variable crosswind averaging 15 to 20 knots, temperature differential creating significant mirage effects, and atmospheric pressure that will affect bullet trajectory by approximately 12 inches at target distance." The technical specifications drew murmurs of disbelief from the students. Even with perfect conditions and unlimited time for calculation and preparation, a 3,000-meter shot represented a convergence of factors so precise that success bordered on miraculous. With the current weather patterns and time constraints, it seemed designed to guarantee failure. What none of them understood, what Sophia had kept hidden even from herself until this moment, was that she had made this exact shot before. Not on a military range under controlled conditions, but in the mountains of Colorado during her final training session with her dying father. It had been his last gift to her, proof that the techniques he had taught her could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity as she approached the firing line. She had been 19 years old, home from her first year of college, when Miguel had insisted on one final trip to their private range in the high country. His condition had deteriorated significantly by then, the cancer having spread throughout his body, but his mind remained sharp, and his knowledge of ballistics remained encyclopedic. "Today, Mija, you're going to learn why God invented mathematics," he had told her, his voice already carrying the hoarseness that would claim it entirely within weeks. "Range is just a number. Wind is just physics. Everything else is confidence and trigger control." The target had been a makeshift affair, a piece of plywood painted with a rough approximation of a human silhouette, and placed on a distant ridge that Miguel had calculated to be exactly 2,987 meters from their shooting position. The conditions had been challenging, but not impossible. A steady wind from the northwest and clear mountain air that provided excellent visibility. But what made the shot truly extraordinary was not the distance or the conditions. It was the fact that Miguel had made her take it 3 times, each under slightly different environmental factors, until she could place bullets within a 2-inch group at nearly 3 kilometers. By the end of that day, she had internalized calculations and compensations that most snipers would never encounter in their entire careers. "Remember," he had whispered as she settled in behind the rifle for the final shot of that session, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Shooting is not about the rifle or the bullet or even the target. It's about understanding that everything in the universe is connected, the wind in the trees, the temperature of the air, the rotation of the earth beneath your feet. When you truly understand those connections, distance becomes irrelevant." Now, as she prepared to honor that lesson under the scrutinizing gaze of her peers and instructors, Sophia felt a profound shift in her relationship with the promise she had made to her father. She had interpreted his words as a prohibition against trading on his reputation, but perhaps she had misunderstood his intent entirely. Perhaps he had wanted her to carry forward his legacy not through concealment, but through demonstration of the skills he had spent his life perfecting. The Barrett MRAD felt different in her hands as she settled into position, not heavier, but somehow more significant, charged with the weight of expectation and the approaching moment of revelation. Around her, the other students had abandoned their own equipment to observe what they assumed would be a spectacular failure. Even the instructors had gathered behind her position, their professional curiosity overcoming their skepticism. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the wind as he established the parameters for the shot. "You have 15 minutes for preparation and calculation," he announced, his tone suggesting that he considered even this generous time frame to be insufficient for the task at hand. "One shot, no sighters, no second chances. This is a pass-or-fail demonstration with no partial credit for near misses." Sophia nodded silently and began the ritualistic preparation that her father had drilled into her consciousness. First, she confirmed her range card calculations, accounting for the altitude of the firing position, the atmospheric pressure, and the temperature differential between her location and the target area. The mathematics were complex but familiar, each variable fitting into equations she could solve intuitively. Next came the environmental assessment that separated competent marksmen from true artists of precision shooting. The wind patterns across 3,000 meters were not uniform. What meteorologists called wind shear created layers of air movement that could push a bullet in different directions during its 4-second flight time. She spent several minutes observing the movement of grass and vegetation at various distances, building a mental map of air currents that would affect her shot. The mirage effects were perhaps the most challenging aspect of the conditions. Heat rising from the valley floor created optical distortions that made precise target identification nearly impossible at extreme range. But Miguel had taught her to read mirage not as a hindrance, but as valuable information. The direction and intensity of the shimmer revealed wind patterns and temperature gradients that could be factored into her calculations. As she worked through her preparation routine, something remarkable began to happen among the observers. The casual mockery and dismissive comments gradually gave way to respectful silence as they recognized the professionalism and expertise evident in every movement. This was not the desperate fumbling of an overmatched amateur, but the methodical preparation of someone who understood exactly what she was attempting to accomplish. "Where did she learn to do that?" Chen asked Rodriguez quietly, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the condescension that had colored his previous comments about Sophia. "That's military procedure," Rodriguez replied, his own voice tinged with growing amazement. "Not basic military procedure, advanced reconnaissance and surveillance techniques that aren't taught in standard sniper schools. She's using range estimation methods that are classified above her security clearance." The observation sent a ripple of unease through the assembled group. If Sophia had access to advanced techniques and classified procedures, It suggested connections and background that none of them had suspected. The quiet librarian from Nebraska was revealing layers of complexity that challenged every assumption they had made about her. With 5 minutes remaining in her preparation time, Sophia began the final phase of her setup. She adjusted the Barrett's elevation turret with movements so precise they seemed almost surgical, each click representing calculations that accounted for gravitational drop, atmospheric resistance, and the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation. Her breathing had settled into the rhythm her father had taught her, slow and controlled, designed to minimize the physiological factors that could affect accuracy. The transformation in her demeanor was visible to everyone present. The uncertainty and nervousness that had characterized her behavior throughout the training program had completely disappeared, replaced by a focus so intense it seemed to create its own gravitational field. When she settled in behind the scope for her final sight picture, even the wind seemed to quiet in anticipation. 60 seconds, Colonel Harrison announced, his voice carrying across the range with military precision. Sophia's breathing slowed to barely perceptible movement as she entered the mental state her father had called the zone, a place where conscious thought gave way to trained instinct and mathematical certainty. Through the powerful scope, the distant target wavered in the mirage like a desert illusion, but her trained eye could discern its true position beneath the optical distortion. The crosshairs settled with mechanical steadiness as she began her final breathing cycle. Everything her father had taught her, every weekend session and patient lesson, had been building toward this moment. The mockery and doubt, the months of isolation and humiliation, all of it had led to this single convergence of skill, preparation, and opportunity. Her finger found the trigger with the familiarity of a pianist touching keys, the two-stage military trigger breaking with the crisp precision that characterized all components of the Barrett system. The rifle's recoil was substantial but controlled, absorbed by her proper positioning and the weapon's advanced muzzle brake design. For 4.1 seconds, the bullet flew through space and time, carrying with it the hopes and expectations of everyone present. It traversed thermal layers and wind currents, fighting gravity and atmospheric resistance as it closed the distance to the target at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The impact was visible through the high-powered spotting scopes before the sound of the shot had finished echoing across the valley. A small puff of dust marked the bullet's arrival at the exact center of the target, striking with such precision that the spotters had to confirm the hit through multiple observations. The silence that followed was profound and absolute, broken only by the persistent wind and the distant sound of the bullet impact finally reaching their position. Every person present understood that they had just witnessed something that would be discussed and remembered for years to come, not just a successful shot, but a demonstration of skill that redefined their understanding of what was humanly possible. Morrison was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying a note of awe that would have been unthinkable just moments earlier. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "she actually made it." But the true significance of the moment was not lost on Colonel Harrison, whose recognition of Sophia's heritage had been confirmed beyond any possible doubt. As she began to secure her equipment with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the demonstration, he approached her position with the bearing of a man who had just witnessed the return of a legend he had thought lost forever. The walk from the firing line to the equipment shed had never felt longer. Sophia moved through a corridor of stunned faces and whispered conversations, her fellow trainees parting before her like she carried some invisible force field. The Barrett MRAD felt lighter in her hands now, as if the successful shot had somehow transferred its weight to the atmosphere around her, charging the air with electricity and possibility. Morrison, who had spent months crafting increasingly cruel variations on jokes about her size and capability, now couldn't meet her eyes. Chen stood frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to process information that his brain refused to accept. Kumar, who had once compared her unfavorably to his little sister, was staring at the distant target through a spotting scope, shaking his head in disbelief as he confirmed what everyone had witnessed. "Confirmed center mass hit at 3,000 meters, he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying a note of reverence that would have been impossible to imagine just hours earlier. "Dead center, perfect shot." Drill Sergeant Williams, whose professional demeanor had carried her through 2 decades of military service, found herself struggling to maintain composure as she watched Sophia methodically clean and secure her rifle. This was not the uncertain recruit who had struggled through physical training and endured months of mockery. This was something else entirely, a marksman whose skills transcended conventional understanding. But it was Colonel Harrison's approach that commanded everyone's attention. The program director walked with the deliberate pace of a man carrying the weight of recognition and revelation, his weathered face reflecting the complex emotions of someone who had just solved a puzzle that had been haunting him for 15 years. "Martinez," he said as he reached her position, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent range. The single word held layers of meaning that only he and Sophia could fully comprehend. She looked up from her equipment, her dark eyes meeting his with the same quiet confidence that had sustained her through months of doubt and derision. But now there was something else in her expression, a recognition that the secret she had carried for so long was no longer hers alone. "Colonel," she replied simply, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion she felt building in her chest. "Walk with me," he said, indicating a direction away from the assembled crowd of students and instructors. It was not a request. They moved in silence for several minutes, leaving behind the buzz of excited conversation and speculation that had erupted among the remaining personnel. The distance provided privacy, but also gave Sophia time to prepare for the conversation she had both dreaded and anticipated since the moment she had decided to enter the sniper program. When they finally stopped, Colonel Harrison turned to face her fully, his expression a mixture of professional respect and personal curiosity that she had never encountered during their previous interactions. "Miguel Martinez," he said quietly, the name carrying the weight of history and loss. "Gunnery Sergeant Miguel Martinez, 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. Operation Enduring Freedom, 2008 through 2010. Sophia felt her carefully constructed emotional barriers begin to crumble. The name, spoken aloud in the context of her father's military service, carried implications that went far beyond family resemblance or coincidental technique. "You knew him," she said. "It was not a question." "I served with him," Harrison replied, his voice carrying the particular tone that military personnel reserved for discussing fallen comrades. "Joint operation in the Kunar province, 2009. Your father saved my life and the lives of 12 other soldiers with a shot that military historians still study." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and the weight of shared history. Sophia had heard fragments of her father's military service over the years, but the details had been sparse and carefully edited for a teenage audience. Now she was confronting the reality of his legacy in its full, classified complexity. 2,847 meters, Harrison continued, his voice taking on the cadence of an official report. High-value target elimination under adverse weather conditions, wind speed exceeding 25 knots, visibility compromised by dust storms, enemy forces actively engaging our position. One shot, one kill, mission accomplished. Sophia felt tears threatening for the first time since her father's funeral, but she maintained her composure through sheer force of will. "He never told me the details," she said quietly. "He said some stories were too heavy for civilian shoulders to carry." "He was right about that," Harrison acknowledged. "But looking at what you just accomplished out there, I'm beginning to understand that you're not exactly civilian material, are you?" The question carried implications that went beyond her performance on the range. It suggested recognition not just of her skill, but of her potential place within the elite community that her father had inhabited during his military service. "I made him a promise," Sophia said, the words coming out in a rush as if a dam had finally burst. "He made me swear that I would never trade on his reputation, that whatever I accomplished would be earned through my own merit. I thought that meant hiding who I was, enduring whatever people thought of me without explanation or defense." Harrison nodded slowly, his understanding evident in his expression. "Miguel always was stubborn about earning respect the hard way," he said with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "But I think you may have misunderstood his intent." The observation struck Sophia like a physical blow, challenging assumptions she had carried for nearly a decade. "What do you mean?" "Your father wasn't asking you to deny your heritage," Harrison explained, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher addressing a particularly important lesson. "He was asking you to prove yourself worthy of it. There's a difference between trading on a reputation and living up to one." The distinction reframed everything Sophia had experienced over the past months. The mockery and doubt, The isolation and struggle, all of it had been necessary not to hide from her father's legacy, but to demonstrate her right to inherit it. "The shot you just made," Harrison continued, "that wasn't beginner's luck or favorable conditions. That was the result of training and preparation that goes back years. Your father didn't just teach you to shoot, he taught you to be a sniper." As if summoned by their conversation, Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached their position, his weathered face reflecting the complex emotions of a man who had just witnessed the impossible become routine. "Colonel," he said, his voice carrying the particular respect reserved for moments of genuine significance, "we need to discuss Martinez's classification and advancement through the program." Harrison turned to include Rodriguez in their conversation, understanding that the implications of Sophia's performance extended far beyond personal recognition. "What are you thinking, Master Sergeant?" "Sir, what we witnessed today doesn't fit within normal program parameters," Rodriguez replied, his professional assessment carrying the weight of 2 decades of training experience. "A 3,000-meter shot under those conditions represents skill that exceeds our advanced course requirements. Frankly, it exceeds the capabilities of most of our instructors." The observation carried implications that were both exciting and intimidating. If Sophia's abilities surpassed the training program's capacity to develop them further, it suggested that her path forward would require considerations beyond conventional military education. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Word of this shot is going to spread throughout the sniper community. A 3,000-meter precision hit is the kind of achievement that gets attention from people who matter. Special operations, intelligence services, units that don't officially exist." Sophia felt a chill of recognition at the implications. Her father had belonged to that shadowy world of classified operations and unofficial missions, a realm where extraordinary skill was both currency and liability. "I'm not ready for that," she said quietly, voicing fears that she had carried since childhood. "I came here to honor his memory, not to replace him." Harrison studied her for a long moment, his expression reflecting the wisdom that came from decades of military service and the recognition of potential that transcended normal expectations. "Maybe that's exactly why you're ready," he said finally. "Your father's legacy isn't a burden to carry, it's a foundation to build upon. What you demonstrated today proves that his teaching didn't die with him." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of the other trainees, who had overcome their initial shock and were now advancing with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Morrison led the group, his face reflecting a transformation so complete it might have been achieved through surgery rather than revelation. "Martinez," he said as he reached their position, his voice carrying none of the mockery that had characterized their previous interactions. That was incredible. I owe you an apology. We all do." Sophia looked at the faces surrounding her, the same people who had spent months predicting her failure and questioning her place in the program. But the expressions she saw now carried something she had never encountered during her military training: genuine respect earned through demonstrated excellence. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, her voice steady and free of the resentment that would have been justified by months of cruel treatment. "We were all here to prove ourselves. I just needed to prove it to myself as much as to anyone else." Chen stepped forward, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional curiosity. "How long have you been shooting?" he asked, the question carrying implications about training and background that went beyond casual hobby shooting. "Since I was 8 years old," Sophia answered honestly for the first time since entering the program. "My father started teaching me the fundamentals before I could properly hold a rifle. He said that marksmanship was like mathematics. The earlier you learned the principles, the more advanced you could become." The answer sparked a new round of questions and speculation, but Harrison's raised hand brought the conversation to a halt. "I think that's enough for today," he said with military authority. "Martinez, report to my office at 800 tomorrow morning. We have some paperwork to complete and some conversations to have about your future in this program." As the group began to disperse, each person carrying their own version of the day's events to share with others, Sophia found herself standing alone with the weight of transformation and possibility. The mockery was over, but in its place came expectations and opportunities that carried their own form of pressure. The Barrett MRAD case sat at her feet, containing the instrument that had changed everything. But as she prepared to return to the barracks that had been her home for the past 8 months, Sophia realized that the rifle had not created her transformation. It had simply revealed what had always been there. Her father's legacy lived not in the weapons he had mastered or the records he had established, but in the principles and dedication he had passed to his daughter. The promise she had made to him was not about hiding from that heritage, but about proving herself worthy of carrying it forward. As the sun set over the training facility, casting long shadows across the range where she had finally found her place, Sophia Martinez understood that her journey was not ending but beginning. The Sniper Queen had been born not from mockery overcome, but from excellence revealed, and the legend that would grow from this day would honor both the father who had taught her and the woman she had proven herself to be. The 3,000-meter shot would become military legend, studied in training programs and discussed in classified briefings for years to come. But for Sophia, it would always represent something more fundamental, the moment when she stopped running from her heritage and embraced the destiny that had been waiting for her since that first weekend lesson with a patient father who believed in possibilities that others could not see. In the distance, targets still stood at impossible ranges, waiting for the next generation of marksmen to test their skills against the mathematics of wind and distance. But they would be measured against a new standard now, a benchmark established by a quiet woman who had proven that excellence could not be predicted by appearance or diminished by doubt. The legacy would continue, carried forward by hands trained in precision and a heart that understood the true weight of the promise she had made to a dying hero. Sophia Martinez had found her place in the world, and the world would never be quite the same.